All right, welcome particularly to first-time ARI folks. And indeed, many of us on the panel are first-time ARI folks, others are veterans. So it's lovely to have you all here. And Katrina, shall I hand over to you and we'll make a start?
Sounds great, I'll get us started. So thanks everybody for being with us today as we explore archival data recovery and reuse across disciplines. I'll introduce RadLab and our respondent, Dr. Borgman, in just a minute. But first, we have a widely distributed group assembled here today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the regions in which we undertake our work. The Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and their Indigenous kin and neighbors on whose traditional territory the University of Maryland resides. As a land-grant university, I want to further acknowledge the 202,000 acres of Indigenous land distributed to the university under the Morrill Act in 1862. We acknowledge the separation that these and other acts of colonialism and assimilation generated between Indigenous peoples and their homelands, as well as their knowledge held in archives, museums, and libraries.
And I would like to acknowledge the Wangsi, Lenape, Canarsie, Wapingers, and other Indigenous people of the region, on whose land that I'm meeting today, and other Indigenous people of North America.
And we are all using Zoom today. Zoom's headquarters have been erected on the unceded land of the Mukwekma Ohlone tribal nation.
And our respondent, Christine Borgman, will join us from the University of California, Los Angeles. UCLA is a land-grant institution that acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavalngar in Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. And finally, we'd like to further acknowledge the continued power and resilience of Indigenous communities and nations and the important contributions Indigenous scholars and practitioners are making to the field of information and archives. A quick note on Zoom logistics. Throughout the presentation, to ask questions or to comment, you're welcome to use the chat. Make sure you select panelists and attendees as the recipients for your chats so that we can all see what you're saying. And then during the dedicated Q&A time at the end of the call, you're welcome to raise your hand using Zoom's raise hand feature, and we'll unmute you to ask your question. So I'm Katrina Fenlon. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland iSchool, and I'm delighted to kick us off today by introducing RadLab, a brand new research lab dedicated to research on recovering and reusing data from archives. Today's presentation will provide an overview of several strands of research that are happening within RadLab, with an opportunity for response from our esteemed guest, Dr. Christine Borgman, whom we'll introduce momentarily. RadLab formed earlier this year in January 2021 at the UMD iSchool to unite various strands of research that intersect at archival data recovery and reuse, projects on recovering historical or defunct scientific data to support active and ongoing scientific research. You'll hear about this in two project contexts covering a wide array of scientific disciplines today, and also on crowdsourcing and user-generated content to augment cultural collections for humanities research, for public use, and so on. This lab sits under the umbrella of the also newly formed Center for Archival Futures at the UMD iSchool, a center that addresses human-centered approaches to the systems, processes, and institutions that care for data and digital objects over time. You'll hear about three projects today representing the complete inaugural cohort of this lab. RadLab is comprised of early career faculty and graduate students from our MLIS and PhD programs, and I'll let my faculty colleagues, Diana and Victoria, introduce themselves.
Hi folks, I'm Diana Marsh. I'm an assistant professor of archives and digital curation here at the iSchool, just finishing up my first year.
And I'm Victoria Van Heining, and first year going to my second year assistant professor of library innovation. And it's my pleasure to introduce Christine Borgman, who I think will be joining us momentarily. Dr. Christine Borgman is a distinguished research professor of information studies at UCLA, where she directs the Center for Knowledge Infrastructures. She conducts research in scientific data practices and information policy, and is the author of over 250 publications in information studies, computer science, communication, and law. Her book, Big Data, Little Data, No Data, Scholarship in the Networked World, was the winner of the 2015 American Publishers Award for Professional and Scholarly Excellence in Computing and Information Sciences. And her previous two books won the Best Information Science Book of the Year award from the Association for Information Science and Technology. Her work on data reuse has been foundational to the field as a whole and an inspiration for RadLab. Over to you, Katrina.
Great. So the first project we'll talk about today is one that I lead on recovering agricultural and other scientific data from archival collections in partnership with the National Agricultural Library. My students, Cooper Clark and Hilary Hsu, both in the MLIS program, and Caitlin Christian Lamb, a PhD candidate here, will present the project.
All right, so the Data Rescue Project arises from the Digital Curation Fellowship Program, a partnership between the National Agricultural Library and the University of Maryland iSchool. Slide, please. The program gives graduate and undergraduate students the opportunity to work alongside information professionals at the NAL, working on real-world curation challenges. Our project is focused on data rescue, which we define as the urgent application of data curation processes to salvage usable data from at-risk collections of materials. The Data Rescue Project has been led by myself and Hilary Hsu.
Cooper and I began our first phase of research in fall 2019 with the initial goal of reviewing current data curation practices and developing a processing guide for the NAL to identify and make legacy data available. The special collections at the NAL, like many memory institutions, maintain collections with data-rich material in a variety of formats, things like logbooks, field notes, and digital files. This data is potentially valuable for data-intensive science in support of new analysis like longitudinal research. Providing data for reuse also support organizations' larger missions such as open data initiatives. However, identifying efficient workflows to make historical data available for computer analysis remains a significant challenge. After literature review, we began our case studies research on 3 NAL collections. Based on our experiences appraising these collections and the literature, we wrote our final report and created the high-level OAIS compliance processing guide. With further synthesis of this information, we developed the 18 assessment factors and the white paper with our colleagues. In this presentation, we will give an introduction about our case studies, the different deliverables, the 18 assessment factors, and how they shape the current research. Our first case study, the Frederick Vernon Colville Blueberry Records, is 3 linear feet long and consists of 24 boxes of fragile handwritten materials. Only 2 of the boxes were digitized and transcribed. The 2 digitized boxes were transcribed by the NAL Special Collections last year and made available through the Biodiversity Heritage Library, but this is a highly labor-intensive process. Colville's records document the earliest crosses of commercial blueberries, for example, how each cultivar was growing, their fruit sizes, and the taste of the blueberries. This information resides in the form of pencil tabular data and field notes on loose leaf pages and notebooks. The images on the slide show a transcribed field note from 1908. On the interface, the scientific name connects to other records about the same type of blueberry by linking the metadata in the digital library. Colville's collection has strong potential reuse value because the detailed documentation of early blueberry cultures may help with genetics research for contemporary cultivation. In fact, some cultivars like Blue Crop are still on the market today. This collection also has historical value because Colville's research contributed greatly to the domestication of blueberries. The second case study, the Wilbur-Olin-Atwater papers, includes over 900 handwritten data sheets that document Atwater's USDA food nutrition and caloric composition studies from the 1890s. Each data sheet represents a different food type. This example is about porterhouse steak, and it documents the calculated fat, protein, and carbohydrate in the steak. Atwater's data sheets are great reusable objects because they provide context for the formulas he created, which are still used in the in caloric calculations today. They also have significant historical value because Atwater is the first person in the US to conduct chemical analysis of food. However, the recovery and reuse of data in this collection remains difficult because the tabular data are presented on handwritten sheets and would require digitization and transcription to enable computer analysis. The third case study is a Born Digital collection contributed by Rufus Cheney, a retired USDA agronomist. This collection has 262 files, about 40 megabytes. Cheney conducted research on crops' uptake of heavy metal, like how much lead, zinc, or cadmium in the soil is absorbed by a certain type of carrots and in what location in the US. The collection includes not only data sets, but also SAS statistical files that may present the analysis steps Cheney used in the research. Born Digital collections present processing challenge different from analog materials. There are 16 different file formats in this collection, including proprietary ones that require format migration for long-term preservation, and others that require data wrangling for data reuse. This collection presents great reuse value because making both the data sets and methodology available would facilitate confirmatory research and reanalysis of the data. Each of these case studies demonstrate the historical and reuse value of data in legacy archival collections. In the following slides, Cooper will describe how these cases evolved to our current study.
Our review of these collections, along with a literature review of data rescue and curation more broadly, informed a white paper and a guide for processing data-rich materials, which covers the complete curation lifecycle. The white paper outlines 18 assessment factors, which are intended for use during the appraisal stage to assess the potential value to researchers, as well as the potential challenges of processing. We derived the assessment factors from several sources identified during our lit review. Most factors like completeness and rarity or uniqueness are adopted from archival appraisal, but are reinterpreted to focus on reuse value and historical value of the data, rather than perceiving the collection as a whole. For example, when assessing the collection's uniqueness, the question is whether the data are duplicated elsewhere or can be easily recreated. For weather records from the 19th century can't be recreated, but an insect genome could be resequenced. As an example, we assessed factors such as reuse value and identified particular reusable objects within the collection through consultation with domain experts. These represent priorities in processing. We independently assessed historical value and historical objects within the collection, which are distinct from reusable objects with different entailments for curation. For more details, see the white paper or our presentations at the Research Data Alliance Plenary and the iConference at the following link. At these conferences, we received feedback from researchers and curators who were also interested in legacy data recovery and reuse. From these conversations, we realized that there was substantial data rescue and recovery going on in scientific centers, but that curation institutions like the NAL are largely unaware of this curation work being done by scientists or by peer institutions. And our current study is exploring this space. We are currently conducting interviews with scientists and professional curators to further understand their practices and processes for recovering data from historical materials, archival and special collections in libraries and archives, or other collections of defunct scientific research materials. And while we refer to archival data, the cases we are examining involve materials across a wide range of institutional settings in various stages of processing. Some are stacks of gray literature in boxes in a basement, while some are a mass of unprocessed digital files of a retired scientist like Hillary just discussed. We are interested in data that are not accessible or usable as such without some kind of intervention by a scientist or a curator, meaning the data are no longer in active use for their original purpose, and someone is trying to recover or rescue these data for reuse in scientific research to produce new knowledge. And what we are trying to learn is what challenges and opportunities confront the recovery and reuse of historical or defunct data for active and ongoing scientific research. What are the value and requirements of data reuse in this context? How are data recovery and reuse efforts across disciplines, domains, and organizational contexts related? And what are the curatorial practices of scientists doing reuse, and what can data curators learn from them? We are speaking with a variety of data researchers and curators from a range of institutions. We have already interviewed data curators from US national libraries and research scientists in agronomy, climatology, and biomedicine. This project is built on an extensive body of literature on data curation, data sharing, and data reuse. The literature on the sharing practices of scientists is well established, but there's still a lot we don't know specifically about data reuse. A 2017 article by Pesquetto, Randles, and Dr. Borgman, who is our respondent for today, identified a set of urgent research questions around reuse, such as, when is data integration an essential goal? How do motivations for data collection influence the ability to reuse data? And how do standards and formats for data release influence reuse opportunities? Our study considers these questions and others in the context of archival data. And our study aims to address the following gaps in our collective knowledge: the breadth and the diversity of the landscape of reuse efforts, reuse in other contexts besides in data repositories or in already accessible data, and the curatorial practices of scientists themselves in the course of reuse.
So we are currently in the process of data collection, having done 5 interviews so far with at least 6 more planned. We are seeking more participants, and more on that in a moment. Our team has been using purposive sampling, identifying potential interviews through colleagues, literature, and previous informal connections. Our coding is qualitative content analysis. We are currently iteratively and inductively building a codebook, deriving themes from transcripts and answer to our research questions. Some themes emerge in direct answer to the questions that we're asking our interviewees, and we expect that others will emerge unexpectedly from the data. We're not far enough along in our process yet to have definitive answers, but there is a subset of emergent themes that we're seeing so far and expect to continue to see as we conduct interviews. The image that's on the screen right now represents some of the codes in the nascent codebook, but other themes include curation practices. How might existing curation practices of scientists inform professional practice in preparing data for open-ended reuse? Data value criteria, use and reuse cases, enabling conditions, what makes recovery and reuse possible. Issues of data ownership and intellectual property have emerged in several of our interviews. How do these impact data reuse in different contexts? Data preservation and management are still not considered a funded priority in non-memory institutions, such as the federal government, and getting individual data creators involved in the process is still a major challenge and obstacle that's come up in many of our interviews. And the interviews are also expressing a desire to place information professionals earlier in the data lifecycle to prevent the necessity of recovery and reuse at this later stage. Next slide, please. So our next steps are that we plan to complete data collection and analysis in fall 2021. We are translating these outcomes into practical guidance for data curators and archivists. We're looking to seek relevance to other collections, disciplines, other forms of data, historical, relevant to non-scientific archives and collections. This will come into play when you hear about some of our other projects in RadLab in a few moments. And we're examining the differences in recovery from analog and born digital collections, such as the Cheney collection that Hillary mentioned earlier. So, as mentioned previously, we're definitely still looking for participants in this project. So, if this sounds like you or anyone you know, such as scientists, curators working on data reuse, specifically focused on the historical or legacy data, using data from historical, archival, or otherwise defunct or non-active collections of materials, please do get in touch with Katrina, whose contact information is on this slide. Next slide, please. And now I will turn it over to Diana Marsh and Selena St. Andre to discuss the next Rad Lab project.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. So welcome to our talk on the attitudes and uses of archival materials among science-based anthropologists. Before I start, I'd like to introduce Selena St. Andre, who's a second-year MLIS student focusing on archives at the iSchool. Slide. So before we get into the specific research that we'll talk about today, it's important to frame it in terms of the larger grant project that it started in at the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian. The NAA, as I'll call it, is part of the Department of Anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History. Among Smithsonian's 15 archives, it's the oldest, tracing its founding to 1879 with the founding of the Bureau of American Ethnology. And pre-COVID, it had the third highest number of in-person researchers among all of those Smithsonian archives. Collections at the NAA include one of the world's largest collections of Indigenous language materials, ethnographic film, Indigenous and Plains artwork, and original field work documentation from all 4 anthropological disciplines, which in the Americanist tradition includes archaeological, biological, cultural, and linguistic anthropology. In 2017, the NAA began a 3-year funded grant from the National Science Foundation that sought to improve data discovery and use of anthropological collections, taking into account the needs of both anthropologists and users and the repository and its staff. And the grant resulted in a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship in which I held before joining the iSchool. And I want to acknowledge that Gabriela Perez-Baez and Joshua Bell were the original PIs on the grant, and Josh Bell, Curator of Globalization and Acting Director of the NAA, is now continuing on as PI. Next slide, please. So the research questions for the broader grant project were, what are the barriers and access to use for our main user communities? What barriers do users encounter? Are there differences between the kinds of barriers that users encounter among different communities? What are the attitudes held by users and researchers? And what's the relationship between archival practice and discovery and access and reuse? Next slide. So the original project was conducted in 2 phases. In the first phase, I conducted an environmental scan, interviews with NAA staff, and analyzed data from fiscal year 2016 to determine the key researcher communities, the top 2 being anthropologists and Indigenous community-based researchers, and then conducted interviews with 22 researchers from the NAA's top 7 groups. And those interviews were analyzed and served as a basis for the survey that we'll talk about today. Next slide. In phase 2, I distributed a national survey to members of 2 participating organizations representing those 2 kind of core user groups. So the American Anthropological Association and the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, or ATOM. And after development, community feedback, and revisions, the survey was distributed via SurveyMonkey and those organizations' networks. The original project was also interested in differences between anthropologists and Indigenous researchers and how they used archives, but today we're just going to be talking about that anthropological community, so the AAA survey. 183 folks started that survey with a completion rate of 83%, and I began by analyzing the data in the surveys in the context of that original project, and some of that has been published in a recent Anthropology Today article if you want to check that out. Next slide, please. So for this project that we're discussing today, we focused on analyzing that wider survey focused on how anthropologists in what we're calling science-based disciplines reused archival data. So why this particular subgroup? Much of the focus of the increasing disciplinary interest in archives and anthropology has been focused in cultural and linguistic anthropology, which are very much grounded in humanistic, historical, and social science methods. but very little has been studied about the how and why of use of archives in biological anthropology, archaeological anthropology, and other subfields that really identify with scientific methods and practices. And in addition to the broad interest in archives and digital curation, in data reuse, there's a demonstrated interest in data reuse specifically within anthropology, and that's demonstrated in the literature. It's demonstrated in open access movements that are echoed in other fields, and it's demonstrated in the creation of many different kinds of digital repositories for storing and sharing data, many of which are really focused on archaeology and biological anthropology data sets. Especially in archaeology, there's an increased interest in the reuse of collections and data and a kind of recognition that the field is increasingly relying on archives. There was actually a recent Advances in Archaeological Practice special issue specifically on archaeology and archives. And that's especially true when you consider the kind of ethics of the field's preoccupation with new fieldwork, the overabundance of museum collections, which is something Sarah Buchanan has written about, and the colonial nature of new fieldwork in many cases. In biological and forensic anthropology, archival papers are also increasingly being used to return ancestral remains through NAGPRA. And myself and other archivists at the NAA often saw researchers from these fields coming to the archives to reinvestigate previous data and to prepare new fieldwork. So there are a lot of really interesting reasons to focus on this particular subgroup of users. Next slide.
So our research questions for this project were modeled on the research questions for the original. You can see the current one listed on the slide. Question 1 was based around how although reuse of archival materials is better understood in the humanities, there isn't much about any differences within science-based professions. Question 2 related to a main theme of barriers from the whole survey. And in question 3, we wanted to better learn about how this group's understanding of archives impacted their research. Next slide. Similar to the original project Diana just discussed, there were several methods to this research. First, Diana sought an amendment to the approved Smithsonian IRB to give me access to the data already collected. Second, we used an early survey question that asked for AAA section membership and isolated a set of respondents based on science-aligned section membership. This gave us a total of 62 respondents, or a little over a third of the original participants. Next, I analyzed the group data by exporting it from SurveyMonkey and importing it into NVivo, a qualitative coding software. I primarily focused on the open-ended responses. I then spent several weeks iteratively coding using the grounded theory approach. This coding happened in 2 rounds. The first for identifying the initial codes as I worked through each question, and the second to group the initial codes into similar categories and establish broader themes. These themes became our main findings, which I'll briefly introduce. Currently, we are working on solidifying and writing up our findings. Next slide. Our first and largest main finding was that there are a lot of barriers and gatekeeping legacies that impact archival research and the ability to reuse data. Respondents talked a lot about access equity issues relating to digital and physical access to collections, as well as the lack of user focus, especially in usability studies. For digital, many within this group wanted to see more material digitized, citing that site research can become very time-consuming, meaning that non-active anthropologists generally had more time to spend at the archives in person. They also discussed more equity in what was chosen for digitization. For physical, most expressed access issues related to travel expenses, especially among early career members, and hoped to see more fellowships or research funding opportunities. Searching methods and discovery was also important to this group. One of the main issues they found with researching in archives was that collections relevant to their work are often dispersed among multiple institutions. For example, an anthropologist may have personal papers, institutional papers, and professional materials at 3 different repositories. To this end, they wanted tools that were aimed at better discovery, such as a central catalog, interconnected institution systems, keyword searching, and having finding aids appear in Google Scholar or elsewhere online besides the Holden repository. For availability and gatekeeping, respondents also noted that accessing materials without institutional affiliation, both digitally and physically, was difficult. In addition, several noted barriers presented by archival staff, such as inadequate reference assistance and collection management issues. Finally, several found that a lack of detailed descriptions limited their usage abilities, mostly in being able to decide from online information if the collection is relevant. Interestingly, participants also talked about cross-referencing collections, similar to the related collections field in finding aids, but with other institutions instead of within. This and other observations about interconnected systems seems to relate to the concept of linked data, although no participant ever mentioned it in those terms. Next slide. Our second finding was that there are many differences in perceptions about archives in terms of importance or usefulness from this group. Even though 79% of respondents in this group have used archives in the past, opinions about the value of archives to the field varied. The first category came from those who valued archives because of the kinds of valuable data that were available. For example, participants talked about the real-world impact that archival data can have, especially in supporting human rights research. We also had some participants that mentioned specific science-related materials they use in archives, such as biospecimen archives or historical X-rays. In addition, archaeologists mentioned that they used archives as another type of artifact in their research and increasingly saw excavation sites as another type of archive. Next, members talked about the benefit of contextual information provided by archives. This context helps researchers to understand recent research and amplifies ongoing fieldwork. In addition, several noted that collections allowed for extensive longitudinal research, with one participant saying, quote, "How else can you get access to much of the work that has gone before?" Some researchers did not see archives as primary research sites, though. These respondents focused on archival research and data as taking a secondary role, as they believed that new research was needed for progress and that the anthropological field overall has a strong bias towards original fieldwork. Next slide. Our third and final finding was an overall need for better knowledge about archives within this community. First is the need for better outreach and communication about archives. In particular, several respondents said they would like for archives to increase their visibility at anthropological meetings and on relevant websites. Others also found issues with navigating usage rights across different institutions, making reuse difficult. There were also many respondents who simply didn't find archives to be relevant to their research, either because they don't think about using these materials, or they believe that archives are meant to be used by the humanities instead of by everyone, including those in the sciences. Those who highly valued archives wanted to see improved perceptions about archives among peers in their disciplines. While many believe archives were critical to good, thorough research, they also recognize a gap between older and younger professionals in terms of historical understanding. This gap may result in a general lack of knowledge about what archives are. Many participants said they didn't understand what archives were or talked about so-called archives they had used in the past, which were actually research repositories. In addition, many spoke of experiences they had working in museum archives rather than traditional archives. Others quite confidently believed that all important archival items were online and that items not available online did not exist. All of this leads to a pressing need for better training in how to locate materials and successfully use archival resources in research. Next slide. Although we are in the process of analyzing closed-ended responses, we do have interesting findings from some questions. Here on the right, almost 80% of our science-based anthropologists have used archives in their research. Yet, anthropologists have received very little formal training. On the left, the top graph shows us that 3/4 of all respondents had no training. Among those who responded to this question in this subgroup, over half did not have training. Therefore, although this profession relies heavily on reusing archival materials, a gap in training helps to create and perpetuate barriers I discussed earlier. Next slide. Indeed, as we discovered, the numbers were similar between the whole group and the science-based anthropologists in terms of those that considered archives as primary research sites in their work, about 2/3 in both cases, as you can see on the pie charts on the slide. Our first few points are related to discovery. We found that anthropological researchers encounter significant barriers in finding relevant collections because of current archival norms, especially the layout of finding aids and the institutional separation of collections between museum collections and archives, or typical pan-institutional archival diaspora. More so, a lack of training in archival research makes it that much harder for researchers to locate related collections, especially when repositories are nested under many branches, as is the case with the NAA.
In addition, our preliminary coding of search terms among the subgroups suggests a tendency toward subject terms, although archaeologists may also search by site locality or names. And as we know, archival collections and finding aids are usually organized by record creator names, and description may not include relevant subjects, especially in this case, which might be fairly niche disciplinary terminologies.
As data reuse is still continuing to grow into the community of practice within anthropology, continued growth may be dependent on the ability to discover data within collections. Further related to a need for training, this community in particular tended to confuse traditional archives with museum archives. Although they can be similar, many thought that traditional archives would hold objects in addition to papers about the object. Many did not realize that different repositories have distinct holdings and each has different operation policies.
And I think that's further exacerbated by the plethora of different digital repositories known in these fields, which often include contemporary data sets along information about object collections and field sites alongside surrogates of archival records. As Faye Nealon et al. In 2013 wrote, and as Morgan Daniels has talked about in her work, archaeologists also feel that museum records lack necessary contextual data they need to find in that they would also often find in other field site data. And that's kind of a shame because, as archivists probably know, it's not that there's not data there in many cases. There's often a lot of contextual data about museum collections, but they're often contained in archival materials that live in different content management systems and physical spaces, even within an institution, or, as Selena discussed, maybe located in other archival institutions entirely. So they're really missing out on a lot of that context by not understanding the nature of archival diaspora and provenance and sort of how to navigate archival collections.
So there's also a disconnect between the importance of archives within the anthropological community, as well as between archives and science-based anthropologists. However, it's interesting to note the gap seen by respondents between older and younger members and their level of knowledge about archives. The same idea was also present when members discussed challenges of not having institutional affiliation versus those that did. This is something that Yackel and Torres wrote about in terms of user expertise as, quote, archival intelligence, or that Johnson Duff study in 2005, noting that the more experience or social capital one has in doing this research, the more likely it is they will have an easier time finding the resources they need via networks and relationships. If new researchers feel like archives are complicated or lack depth when everything isn't available online and don't have the time to commit to the research nor the training to know how, are these disconnects going to continue to grow when it seems like the field is turning more and more towards reusing archival data? Finally, over the past 10 years especially, archives have increased their focus on user needs. Work on data reuse has argued that repositories can shape new norms by working with user communities. But how are archives listening to user feedback in order to improve their practices and workflows? In a perfect world, flush with resources and staff, archives would be able to collaborate closely with their main communities to shape how the repository can best support the researcher and vice versa. With closer collaborations and actions based on user feedback, archives, especially anthropological archives, can have an impact on how communities view and use collections. All this said, we understand that the majority of repositories don't have the resources to conduct these kinds of formal user studies. Rather, staff can pay attention to the types of researchers using their collections the most and pay attention to their needs and make small changes based on what they are witnessing firsthand. Next slide.
Lastly, I want to thank Selena for all of this incredible work in just one semester. Extremely impressive. The NSF, Josh Bell, PI, our wider project team, the advisory team who's provided guidance throughout the project listed here, and to all the NAA staff who have facilitated and continue to facilitate this research, and of course, our willing survey participants. And now I'd like to hand it over to Victoria Van Heining and Hannah Frisch.
Thanks, everybody. I'm just gonna play around with some spotlighting here, try to get Hannah back. Okay. So hi again, I'm Victoria Van Heining, and in this portion of the presentation, Hannah Frisch and I will present our recent work about strategies for incorporating user-contributed content into GLAM content management systems. We will give a few examples from our recent and forthcoming publications, and I'll just give a quick update. For those who may be wondering, Christine is on the phone with us and will be hopping online, I think in the next sort of 10 minutes or so. And so I'll just take an extra moment here, which I wasn't planning to say that the image that we're showing here is of David Driscoll, who's the subject of one of the case studies we're going to be talking about today. He was an art historian and artist, professor at the University of Maryland, and he's shown here with one of his classes and alongside a document that is in his papers. And I will now hand over to Hannah. So next slide, please.
Hi everyone, this is Hannah, and I'm a recent graduate of the MLIS program at UMD. So over the past 3 months, Catherine Crow of the NAA, Katrina Fenlon, Diana Marsh, Victoria Van Heining, and I participated in the Lighting the Way IMLS funded workshop hosted by Stanford University. The workshop aims to produce a handbook that addresses the challenges and methods to improve access and discovery of archival collections. Our contribution is titled Inviting and Honoring User-Contributed Content, and sheds light on existing practices, common challenges, and emerging solutions to user-contributed content integration. So what do we mean by user-contributed content, hereafter called UCC? Next slide, please. We adapted the concepts of social metadata and public contributed content deployed by Sharon Lee Liu in 2016 and concepts drawn from community archives and crowdsourcing under the broader term of user-contributed content. UCC encompasses tags, notes, annotations, images, personal memories and archives, indigenous knowledge, transcriptions, and publications about collections, data sets, and more. Next slide, please. In our contribution, we highlighted the importance of advocating for the incorporation of UCC into archival collections. We draw on our personal experiences, research, as well as policy and practice work to offer case studies from several domains, including crowdsourcing, community collaborations and collections, particularly indigenous collections, and examples of generative scholarly practices that result in the rich data that could dramatically enhance the utility of GLAM collections, but for which there are weak incentives to share and deposit the data. We write in the handbook, quote, "The creation and management of cultural knowledge happens in many domains outside of cultural institutions, and the need and opportunities to unite the community and institutional knowledge are growing. The case for the union strengthens as the precarity of cultural collections outside of cultural institutions, such as digital humanities, scholarship, and community archives, becomes clearer, and as the benefits to institutional collections are made visible by a growing number of initiatives. We will focus on UCC derived through institutional crowdsourcing projects for the remainder of our presentation." Next slide, please. As the slide outlines, crowdsourcing and archives can expand access to knowledge, improve accessibility, and deepen community engagement. However, there are also many challenges that crowdsourcing creates, as well as it exposes existing infrastructure challenges within GLAMs. Challenges of authority between the archivist and the public, as well as the resource-intensive work to build a crowdsourcing platform, engage and provide help to volunteers, clean the crowdsourced data, and then integrate the data into the content management system all exist. With all the great advantages of crowdsourcing, it comes with these challenges and others that need to be addressed. Next slide, please. Christine Borgman, Lucinda Blazer, Inya Maria Jansen, and others have previously identified both the promises and perils of cultural heritage and academic-led crowdsourcing projects. Blazer's assessment of the Old Weather Project, which was created on the Zooniverse platform in 2011, sums it up well. Although broadly happy with the levels of engagement and community participation in the project, she noted that there are many technological challenges to incorporating the results. Quote, "Of course, crowdsourcing in citizen science cannot be seen as a solution to all problems that cultural institutions face with their collections. These projects present their own set of problems, such as the best way to incorporate the generated data back into the institution system." Back over to Victoria for our first case study. Next slide.
Thanks, Hannah. The By the People crowdsourced transcription project for the Library of Congress is one of our case studies in the Lighting the Way paper. I'm speaking as a former architect and community manager for this project, and I just want to point you all to crowd@loc.gov as the best email to reach the current team if you're interested in learning more about the project, the platform that it was built upon, or the resulting data. In addition to working on the By the People project, I was also involved with Zooniverse, which is a leading academic crowdsourcing platform that was established after the success of Galaxy Zoo, a specific crowdsourcing project, which Christine has written a lot about. I was with Zooniverse as a postdoctoral scholar focusing on humanities and cultural heritage projects, and then later as the humanities PI in total from 2014 to 2018. Many of the lessons from that platform informed my work at the Library of Congress and my ongoing work using the From the Page platform, which Hannah will tell us about more later in this talk. Although the Library of Congress is a large and relatively well-funded institution, and the By the People project is a well-resourced project, both in terms of the people who are directly involved in hosting the community and engaging with volunteers and inputting content, there's also a much larger family of practitioners surrounding the project, subject area specialists in American history and literature, for example, and technologists who help to make the data reuse possible. But I think that the lessons and the ways that we went about ingesting and making the data available are probably amenable to a number of other institutions of various sizes and discipline. By the People gathers data through a standalone transcription platform called Concordia, which is an open access platform, and it's available for use and reuse. The code is on GitHub. It's not plug and play, but if you have the internal resources to deploy it, I think it is a well-designed system. Obviously, I'm a little biased. Volunteers are invited to transcribe documents that they see. The image on the screen right now shows one such document. Volunteers transcribe text roughly in the order that they see it, and that makes sense to read out loud. The purpose is to create data sets that are amenable for machine learning, but also to make handwritten material amenable to screen readers, so people with low or no visibility are able to hear the text through a screen reader. Materials are then reviewed by fellow volunteers, and a subset of the pages from each campaign, which is the organizing structure of the pages on the site, are then spot checked by Library of Congress staff before they're returned to the library's main discovery system on loc.gov. The goal, as I said, is really to create maximally searchable and accessible transcriptions that get people down to the page level, but also to create data sets for use and reuse. Next slide, please. Once all pages in a By the People campaign are transcribed, the page level transcriptions are uploaded to loc.gov. Users can download transcriptions of individual pages or whole documents, and the volunteers are credited in two places. First, in an overlay in a text box displayed against the transcription, and also in the text file associated for download with the image itself. The attribution reads transcribed and reviewed by contributors participating on the By the People project. And just as a quick side note, it used to actually say transcribed and reviewed by volunteers, but after the coronavirus sent everybody home, we created a series of staff-only campaigns to facilitate telework and ongoing engagement with collections for staff. And so this acknowledgement, although it's doing so in sort of a quiet way, is acknowledging the breadth of the community. Next slide, please. In addition to making transcriptions available alongside original images, we developed a pipeline for publishing completed transcription datasets for bulk download as CSV files with README documents describing how the data were created. This includes information about the collections, which was originally created by archivists, so drawn from finding aids typically, and description of the By the People project and platform itself to give context to those wanting to reuse the data. The CSV files contain transcriptions as well as links to the original images. The images are not available for bulk download through this method, but they are available through the Library of Congress's API, for which there is documentation. If anybody wants to know more, I can point you in the right direction. On the screen, we're displaying an image of 2 of the 7 data sets that are currently available: the diary and correspondence of a Union Civil War soldier who was imprisoned at Andersonville, and the papers of Rosa Parks. Other data sets pertain to presidents, poets, suffragists, and other prominent American figures, and they can be used, on their own, in combination, and so on. Next slide, please. The By the People team and I are in the process of writing a short data paper for the Journal of Open Humanities Data. I serve on the board for this I serve on the editorial board for the journal. It was launched in 2015. It's open access and peer reviewed. And there are 2 main publication types for the journal: short data papers of 1,000 words. These really consist of descriptions of data sets with high reuse potential, and longer full-length research papers of 3,000 to 5,000 words, which discuss methods, challenges, limitations in the creation, collection, management of humanities data. And I've put the contact for the editor-in-chief, Barbara McGilvray, here. And feel free to follow us on Twitter and all like that, or be in touch with me. I'm happy to provide further information. We're going to be continuing work on this piece. Incoming Rad Lab members, some of whom are here today, are going to be working on this and on reusing some of the data from By the People more generally. I'm going to hand back over to Hannah now to discuss a new crowdsourcing project at the University of Maryland. Slide, please.
The David C. Driscoll Papers Transcription Project was developed as a grad student class project in the course Outreach, Inclusion, and Crowdsourcing, taught by Victoria, and in collaboration with the David C. Driscoll Center in fall 2020. The goal of the project was to celebrate and honor the life and legacy of David Driscoll, an African-American artist, educator, historian, advocate, and champion of African-American art and artists. Professor Driscoll sadly died from complications due to COVID-19 on April 1st, 2020. The project aims to encourage community engagement with his writings and ultimately promote discovery and increased accessibility of the collections. 6 graduate students, including myself, utilized the From the Page transcription software to build a crowdsourcing transcription site for Driscoll's papers. We included about 1,000 pages from the collections and created extensive scaffolding to help users engage with Driscoll's papers. We knew that there were going to be challenges of where to store the data once the transcriptions were completed. This is a common challenge for many CMSs in cultural heritage, and Victoria, the Driscoll Center, and the Rad Lab will keep exploring options in the coming year. Next slide, please. This is an image of how volunteers transcribe the papers on From the Page. Like By the People, this transcription process has at least 2 sets of eyes on every page. 1 or more people can transcribe the page, and then 1 person reviews it. Peer review has proved to be a fairly accurate and on most crowdsourced projects, and is typically higher quality than the OCR that most institutions publish with their printed works. Next slide, please. So now we have all of this really rich text transcription data created by all of our wonderful volunteers on From the Page. From the Page allows you to export the transcriptions in multiple file formats. But once we have exported the data, how do we get it into the Driscoll Center Past Perfect CMS? How do we, as we've discussed in the case study of By the People and advocated for in our Lighting the Way paper, bring these data back into the discovery system or make them usable in some other way? Currently, the papers in Past Perfect are organized on a folder rather than item level, and the images are not all uploaded into Past Perfect. Past Perfect is a CMS that is really optimized for objects rather than archives. This creates a challenge of how to store the individual page-level transcriptions we now have within the existing organization of the CMS. These challenges are very common in smaller organizations, particularly with diverse holdings. A short-term solution would be to release the data and corresponding images in bulk using CSV files, but this doesn't enhance the core discovery system. A long-term solution would be to adopt a CMS that has space for item-level full-text transcriptions. However, this would be both a really time and resource-consuming task for a small archive like the Driscoll Center, and would not allow for a timely release of the UCC transcriptions. The ideal scenario would be to integrate the full-text transcriptions data into a metadata field for the item so that the information can be accessed and searched by users. We have identified that PastPerfect can hold full-text transcriptions in a custom metadata field. However, there's not a method to bulk import a new metadata field into existing records, so we would have to copy and paste each transcription into the associated record. We also have the issue of needing item-level metadata within a folder-level structure. So we are currently corresponding with PastPerfect, researching case studies from other universities and institutions using PastPerfect in similar ways, as well as collaborating with the Driscoll Center archivist, David Conway, to ensure the system works for the Driscoll Center and its users. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Hannah. So in conclusion, crowdsourcing can be used to improve the accessibility of collections, deepening community engagement, research opportunities, but there is still more research and work that needs to be done to make the integration of new data types into existing CMSs feasible for archival institutions. And again, that issue about the very different content management structures for different types of cultural heritage organizations is a pretty significant piece of this. In my experience over the last 7 years, it's clear that many organizations didn't anticipate the challenges of UCC integration. And for some, it may be embarrassing to discuss this publicly. And even those that really successfully overcome the challenges, I think there can be a reticence or time constraints on information sharing. And I think that that's something that the Rad Lab can help with, to work with practitioners, gathering their experiences via survey. And as our collaborators throughout the other talks have mentioned, try to come up with suggestions for joined up practice and methodologies that maybe look across multiple domains and draw best practice from a variety of places, and get that into the hand of practitioners so that we can really fully deliver on the promise, implicit and explicit, that we make to volunteers when we invite them to contribute content to our collections, that we are going to, or that they are helping to make the research of today and the future more equitable and accessible, and to further human knowledge on a number of different fronts. The Rad Lab plans to continue researching UCC integration into archival CMSs writ broad, and of course, the Driscoll Center transcriptions will remain an important test case. Final slide, please. So the Rad Lab is rapidly evolving, and we're eager for new opportunities for collaboration, as others have already said. If you're interested in what you've learned about us today, we strongly encourage you to get in touch. Kay Fenlon at umd.edu, D Marsh at umd.edu, and VBH at umd.edu. Our future work will continue to explore archival data recovery and reuse across more institutional and community contexts, a wider array of disciplines and areas than we've started with already, and supporting diverse use and reuse possibilities, and finally understanding ethical implications and social impacts of the work that we do and that happens in cultural heritage. We invite you all to join us on the first Wednesdays of each month during the semester, so usually from September to mid-December, and then early February to mid-May. For the Center for Archival Futures talks, we invite people who are doing a range of exciting work in areas that are sort of at the boundary of new practice, or trying to stitch together best practice from a range of other areas. We have a link to cafeiSchool.umd.edu/events in the slide here, and maybe a collaborator would be kind and put that in the chat if we haven't done so already. Christine, if you are with us on the online now, instead of on the phone, I think one of my comrades can unmute you. And if not, we can move over to some Q&A, and then Christine, when you can offer your response.
I'm here. Can you hear me? I've turned on my camera and my video.
Fantastic.
I'm not seeing myself on the screen yet, though.
Spotlight you momentarily.
Okay.
Hopefully. Or go gallery. There you are with that lovely image in the background. All right, over to you, Christine. Thank you so much.
Yes, well, thank to all of you for your patience. Even in an age of Zoom, I can't be in too many places at once. So had to be in several to get here, and use multimedia to listen to you along the way, and appreciate having the slides in advance. Let me just make a few remarks about some of the content and try to set it in a broader context and throw it open for what I hope will be a broad discussion with the whole community and participants here. First, let me congratulate the Rad Lab and encourage this kind of work, because data reuse has just not gotten as much attention in archives or in broader areas of information schools that it deserves. It's a very hot area. We had a National Academy of Sciences workshop in late April in support of the new NIH data sharing plan to reach out to the community. We had more than 3,000 people show up for that Zoom. I mean, it's a really big issue about data sharing and reuse in other fields. So I wish we would have more of our own colleagues on top of this set of issues. So just some comments on the specific points here. I don't have slides, but on the reuse value, you pointed out how difficult it is to anticipate the kinds of reuse. And some of the things that we talked about in our own work are some of the differences between reusing data for comparative purposes, which is a very common practice in the sciences, especially in genomics. We see it in astronomy and other areas. Where reusing data to start a new project is a very different kind of activity. That's the data creator's advantage point in one of the articles of ours that you cited. So thinking about how they might be reused and distinguishing between independent reuse, where you can take content from the archive and use it directly, versus reusing data when you need to contact the people who created the data in the first place. Now, if the data were created centuries ago, that's a different matter entirely, but there's some distance questions in there that we could pull out even more than you already have. Another piece that you touched on, I think, is also worth pulling out for further work, is how linking to publications adds metadata and is very important for discovery and reuse. Finding data sets is a huge, huge problem. And this was the topic of Kathleen Gregory's dissertation, cum laude from Maastricht, by the way, just a couple of months ago. And she and Sally Wyatt, Andreas Scharnhorst, Paul Groth, and others have written several papers in JSIST and elsewhere about the data search problems. Another aspect of that I've been working on, along with just a very large number of other people, is data citation. People don't agree on what are data in the first place, much less what's a data set. They will at best mention data sets in passing in their articles. We don't have a good mechanism and we don't have good practices around data citation. So something else that people are working on is data mining to find data sets. And I point you to the work of Julia Lane at NYU and the Coleridge collaboration that she has going there. So the more metadata that you can get into the documents, the more mineable they become, and the more you may promote some of the reuse. Getting reuse cases, as the Rad Lab has done, is also valuable. Just getting those cases out there gives people examples from which to work. I'm not surprised that anthropology has a growing interest in reuse. Everybody seems to have a growing interest in reuse, but getting the data out there to be able to use them is hard. Now, I'm not surprised that the users were unaware of archives and not how they work. I had a running conversation, including today, with one of the astronomers that I work most closely with. And I've been trying to help that group organize their 25 years worth of data so that they can reuse them over time. And I realized that despite working with them for 5 years or so, we've been starting from the data and trying to lift up and say, how is it that you want to organize it? What are the use cases? What might you want to use it for in the future? What problems, what roadblocks are you running up against? And realizing that even though these are very top flight scientists, they don't have a good model of what an archive is or what could be done with it. So I've flipped it around and started trying to explain the OAIS reference model to astronomers, which is itself a very interesting set of conversations, and been sharing the stacks of books of some things on my shelf. But I'm also finding that pretty much all that I could put my hands on is designed for librarians and archivists as an audience, assuming they're going to go and help the poor scientists. There's not much out there that's written for the scientists, for the researchers themselves. So I think that's a next frontier as you work with these groups. See if you can try to put more things into their words in ways that you can help them organize some of their own material. The point of the last one, we have the data, now what, echoes an earlier piece of ours when we said, if we share data, will anyone use them? Is, again, of where do we go from here and how do you get them out there? It's hard to integrate data not only into the content management systems you mentioned, but the differences are sometimes technical standards, but more often they are just human differences in the way people think about organizing their data in the first place. And this paper that we just put out this week, and I sent to the panelists on the astronomy data, shows you just the very different ways that even astronomers from different kinds of scientists think about their own data. We had some cases in the Center for Embedded Sensing work, network sensing work earlier, where we found that the way that the environmental scientists organized their data was different than the way the land use people organized it, which was different for the water quality people, different from the state, different from the county, and everybody had to appeal to their own constituencies, and bringing those back together again was a big piece of the aggregation problem. So I think to wrap up, I would say, certainly yay, raw, keep this work going. Much more is needed, but there's certainly a gap between the way the archival community thinks about organizing data and the way that scientists think about organizing their own data. And the more we can do to get people at the table and talk about them, the better. And then lastly, that we need to make more clear the difference between preservation and stewardship, which is something that people in the archival and library community will say, well, kind of duh, that's obvious, but it's not at all obvious when you talk to people who are on the ground taking care of their own data. They'll tell you, oh, it's backed up over the computer center. Having it backed up is very different than having it in a form where those data are remain scientifically usable in the present and in the longer term. And I'm very glad to see you working along that directions. So let me stop there because there's plenty of other people and questions you want to say, and I'll stay on and be happy to participate in the question discussions if that's helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Just as a reminder, as Katrina mentioned at the beginning, you can feel free to use the raise hand function and we'll unmute you. And of course, you can always put questions in the chat. Perhaps I'll get us started just to warm us up. To Katrina and your team, and anyone can respond to this. I know you're very early stages on your interviews, but from the first 5, I'm curious if you've thus far, what are the kind of most interesting, meaningful, wacky reuses or uses you've heard about? Maybe you can provide an example. I think that would be sort of neat as a sneak peek for those of us who will be probably waiting a little bit for analysis.
Sure. I think I would love to hear Hillary and Cooper and Caitlin, your responses to this question, but the one that springs to mind for me is actually the example that got us started on this research in the first place and later became an interview. It started as a conversation through the AgNIC network of agricultural researchers, and then later became one of our interviews. But it was a situation where there was a very large scale project related to dairy farming, and as sort of an offshoot of the project, the PIs had to, I apologize for my dog in the background, the PIs had discovered a basement full of boxes of gray literature from agricultural publications, conferences, especially in the, throughout the last century. And so a scientist had been sort of wading through these boxes in the basement of their research center and picking out data that they were planning to combine or integrate with contemporary data for use in machine learning work. And what she was doing was hand transcribing data from charts, from images, and sort of trying to deduce what the numbers were and then translating those into spreadsheets to see whether they were going to get data of potential value. And it, the amount of work that was going into this, finding this valuable data, but also in a format that is utterly, not amenable to computational work that began as an image, not only an image, but an image in a print publication, in a box, in a basement, in a research center, sort of the layers that she was navigating on her own without any assistance from any kind of curation professional or even any intention to make the data more widely available is fascinating to us. And that's what got us wondering, like, how common is this practice? How often are people engaging this level of curation work with archival materials to do scientific research? So that's the example that springs to mind, and it calls for me into question the framework that that Christine mentioned. It has been very useful to us as we start to think about the kinds of reuse that are happening, whether they are comparative or integrative, or whether they are independent and fundamentally new projects that scientists are undertaking, and what does that mean for how we think about the curation work that's happening. And Cooper and Hillary, if you have other examples, and Caitlin, other examples, please do jump in.
Yeah, I'll add one, and I'm trying to keep this as anonymous as I can for our IRB. There was one interview with a climatologist, and just like Dr. Borgman had mentioned, the data was so far removed from the original creator and the original tools they had used to capture the data that this data scientist is really becoming part historian, because they have to really go back and discover where is this data being collected from in this very specific location. And it's just very interesting to see how he had really become almost a historian.
Yeah, I have a fun one to share, very short, but I was interested in one of our participants, like Cooper, trying to keep this as anonymous as possible, talked about a project in which they created games in order to aid in transcription for OCR. And part of it was like a test just to see, could you even use, would gaming be a good output in order to transcribe things more widely to then make them amenable to reuse? And I just thought it was a really fun description of both an interesting way to do that, but the games themselves also sounded really fun to play.
For Victoria and Hannah, I was curious. I mean, I think obviously there's a through line, as Christine was just mentioning, about, who are the different communities of reuse and how do we best articulate and kind of create relationships across repositories and these different communities of users and reusers. And I'm wondering, in the case of, in both of the two case studies that you provided from both LOC and from the Driscoll Center, who are the main reusers thus far of any of these transcriptions or data sets, or who might they be, I suppose?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think it's helpful to go back a little bit in time to when I was trying to convince Chris Lintott, who's the PI of the Zooniverse platform, that we should do more transcription. So there had been a few projects, and it was a question that I was brought on to answer, or to start working with various people in cultural heritage and academia to answer, which is, what are our greatest areas of need in terms of data collection and analysis? And I think he was a little bit skeptical that it would be transcription. And I likened collecting transcription data to something akin to building the telescope. We don't even really know what we have. It's sort of like the transcription project is the collecting of observational data, and then we can start asking the questions. And I think for a lot of archival practice and archival use, we think about how do we make or I hope we think about how do we make our finding aids sort of maximally useful without curtailing future inquiry. And we know we can't future-proof, and we know we can't anticipate and build for every question, and that's why we need to redescribe and revisit, even though we always have a pretty serious backlog and growing arrearage at the same time. So that's sort of a non-answer in a sense, but I think it it's important to say that a lot of folks, I would say, in the humanities generally haven't really worked with really large corpora that are amenable to digital manipulation, whether that's text or tags or image data. And I think that's a real growth area in humanities, and there's a real need for additional training about what are the questions and what are the methodologies that we can even bring to this. But in one of my own experiences of working with other people's transcriptions of long convent chronicle texts from the 16th and 17th century, I couldn't have done the type of analysis and the work I did to identify previously anonymous authors if I didn't have their transcription data and my own images and our broader community of practice, sharing data and sharing information. And in addition to all of that, an emerging prosopographical, historical biographical tool that was being built at the time. It was sort of a perfect confluence of materials. And so I'm hoping that those are the kinds of things. And it was that experience, I should say, that brought me to crowdsourcing in the first place, was I can see that I can do things that I would never have been able to do as a true sole practitioner working with texts that had never been edited. So that was a very long answer, but Hannah, do you want to add anything from our semester?
So our transcription project at the Driscoll Center is still very much underway, as from the presentation. So we don't have any current reusers of our data, but we have a bunch of letters and just papers from Driscoll and others corresponding with him. So just making that those words just more easily searchable to find new information, as well as just to improve the general accessibility. We're hoping that will help any users of the Driscoll archives.
See, we have a hand up from Christine. Oh, go ahead, Christine.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay, good. I was unmuted there. Good. My question is back to all of you about what you've learned of what the data creators are looking for. What is it that they want you to help them with, either with their own data or with finding other kinds of materials that become their data in the archive? The archival field is desperately short on user studies, in my experience.
I agree, and I guess I can jump in first, and if others want to join. So, you know, we began our case studies with data sets where the creators were inaccessible, and we were thinking at the time in our partnership with NAL, thinking about the possibilities of open-ended reuse. So thinking about what it would take to move these data into the Ag Data Commons data repository, and to augment them with sufficient metadata to make them usable. And in our interviews, we've started interacting with data creators now. So now we're seeing a little bit more from the opposite perspective. And it's been an interesting mix of talking to people who are doing professional curation work and people who are creating data and hoping to reuse data. And the ones who I think my impression, and my colleagues here, Cooper and Hillary and Caitlin, you're welcome to disagree or expand on what I say. My impression is that the data creators are looking for guidance on the full curation lifecycle. And I think, Christine, your point that you made about needing to do more work to sort of translate professional practices into guidance that's actually of use to scientists, something that we felt very urgently in our project. We created a processing guide that was intended for use by staff at the NAL to process these data-rich historical collections into their repository. And we tried sharing the processing guide with the scientists who asked for it among our interviewees so far. I think it was fascinating to them, the range of issues that they needed to be considering, but also, it was also based on OAS, and I think it was at just too high a level. So there's a real need for some of this translation work. But it got me wondering, a lot of the work that's gone into creating data curation data sharing centered on trying to figure out roles for where do they sort of do the handoff, and whose job is it to do the descriptive work or the preparatory work that makes things amenable to preservation over time. And it makes me wonder, where does that fit here? These scientists, some of them are interested in bringing this data into and them are just trying to get stuff out of archival materials for their own use and have relatively little interest in sharing. Is where are the roles emergent, and who do they belong to, and how we divide the curation responsibilities, especially if they're available to sort of assist with the work.
Anna, did you, or somebody else, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's been very interesting in anthropology. I think the data creators, so in some cases, data creators are very eager to have their materials placed in some of these digital repositories that have been created, like TDAR is a big one. But there's kind of been a long-standing reluctancy in the field of anthropology to give materials to archives, in part because about worries about field site localities and those kinds of things. Classically in cultural anthropology, anthropologists use their field notes like personal diaries with all kinds of stuff in there. And so there was a long, there's the Council for the Preservation of Anthropological Records, which was founded in the 90s, spent a lot of time trying to basically advocating like anthropologists should try to keep their stuff and not destroy it and put it somewhere. And I think the field got decently well along in that regard, to the point that like the National Anthropological Archives like now almost has too much material, right? But I think now we're kind of on the other end where, you know, the field has acknowledged that archival materials are really important. We're seeing that, in fact, they are using archival materials, you know, however defined, and yet there's still a sort of a little bit of an obsession with new fieldwork as the primary currency, especially in getting your PhD or, you know, sort of like making it in the field. And so I think now a lot of the discussion is about like how to, first of all, how to allow the reuse of data to be considered primary research that's valid. And then how, and of course, how to do that ethically, and then how to make all of this material usable, as, you know, we've been talking about across these different fields. And I think in some of the things that Selena talked about in terms of the relationality between collections, especially between, say, object collections and archives, or between different archival collections, is a big problem that I think is in anthropology, but is basically for anybody trying to understand data reuse in archives. And then just sort of navigatability of a bunch of this stuff, discoverability of a lot of this stuff, and trying to make it, like Hillary was talking about, you know, with those you know, spreadsheets, like how do you deal with that? So I think now there's a lot of interest, some reluctancy that, you know, lingers, but certainly it's starting to happen. And I think I really appreciated, Christine, what you said about potentially our role in helping to create some of that dialogue. I think there's there are lots of opportunities to do that, whether at conferences or through publications that we can sort of try to slot ourselves into. I have a question from an attendee in the Q&A. When it comes to terms and conditions of data reuse and republication, how do you handle issues of intellectual property, copyright licensing with archival material? Who wants to take that first?
I can jump into this a little bit and say one way that institutions deal with it is not to release images as bulk data, although a lot of the time they are scrapable from, you know, various websites, and to release instead metadata and, you know, in the case of the By the People example, the transcription, so links back to loc.gov. But there are, you know, real serious sensitivities. And I would also say too, in the case of some collections where actually the estate has given permission for things to be online, and I think for a variety of reasons maybe don't understand what that can open out to and lead to, and there can be some real sensitivities for contemporary living or recently deceased individuals to sort of try to control reputational content. And that is something that I think is really challenging. But again, like I think trying to, you know, if you're a practicing archivist or other cultural heritage practitioner, or you're working within a university with folks who may be depositing their data or thinking about that, trying to come up with some pretty plain language, understandable agreements, and encourage, as much as it seems appropriate, a dialogue, you know, with the person about possibilities of reuse and what this could mean. I think sometimes that is really helpful, and try to use, you know, plain language descriptors as well as, you know, formal licensing language, so that because sometimes people find things, and I suspect Christine could speak more to this, but by using license types to go and find data. So they only want to see data that's been released under X license. But it's complicated. A lot of really large institutions don't want to, they have to be very careful not to misstep in these ways. And I think a lot of us have worked with or heard about collections where somebody has given permission and then taken it away, or can gatekeep access, and that's their prerogative, to be honest. Christine, I see you're unmuted.
Sure. I mean, the obvious part is to get the license up front when you acquire the materials. And that's certainly how it works in the sciences and the other areas. And then we also, in the sciences, we put proprietary periods on things, or when they'll release, and similar in archives. The difficulty, of course, is that the data records, specimens, whatever you want to call them, take on a different kind of value when they are mined and combined with other things. And this is part of the general privacy set of issues. Is notice and consent has been insufficient for a long time, because it's one thing to say, yes, you can have my location for this purpose. It's quite something else to realize what happens when you combine that with lots of other things. And so permissions that were given in an age before data mining take on different situations now. So data repositories are needing to think in terms of much more sophisticated kinds of mining. We've been moving in the information retrieval area for a long time away from assuming hands-on keyboard to assuming that it's a robotic user who's going to want to get do what they call the opposite of close reading is distant reading, where you mine and aggregate and combine. And so it's like you say, the people in the humanities, there's not that many that are familiar with what happens when you do that kind of distant reading. But it's the computer becomes both a microscope and a telescope when you start using them in different ways. And it's that anticipation of reuse that's the challenge, but there's no substitute for getting good licensing, and then also dealing with metadata for licensing, which I think is something that was proposed 20 years ago, and there's some early work in some of the original Digital Libraries Initiative. I'm not sure it's gotten anywhere near as general take-up as it deserves.
I'll just also jump in that, certainly in anthropological archives, what Christine was just saying about consent is magnified by the colonial relationships in which the records were created, and the genocide in which that was taking place. And so certainly with anthropological records, whether they're archaeological, biological, like we were talking about today, which can contain not only PII, but really traumatic kinds of physical anthropology collections, right? That were basically objectifying people in a pursuit of scientific racist ideas, right? So those kinds of collections are held in these archives, as well as other kinds of collections and photographs and things that really should not be seen. And so the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials is a guideline that's now been adopted by the Society of American Archivists as of 2018 at long last. So a lot of archives are trying to work with those slowly. And of course, the placing cultural restrictions on materials, whether they're archaeological or other, restricting human and ancestral remains, or any kind of imagery in that regard. And another thing I've seen that happened at the NAA that was really interesting, and I will say I played a little bit of a part in this. We piloted IRB for our archival researchers, which is a kind of odd thing to do in a certain way, because we're talking about, we're not talking about living persons, but they may be persons who have descendants, or they may be people who, whose physical bodies were documented in an unethical way, but that potentially the reuse of that data could be used ethically to, say, disprove a certain kind of argument or disprove a certain kind of set of legal cases or something like that. And so we actually instituted a process for researchers wanting to come to the archives to see materials that were restricted either for PII or something else, that they could apply, not necessarily be granted, apply through IRB to get special access to these collections. And basically, if that ethical harm was considered low risk in some way by the Central Smithsonian IRB, they were potentially able to be granted, limited access to certain kinds of collections. So that was something pretty interesting that I think is fairly newish as a sort of archival policy for thinking about those collections. Again, I'm talking mostly about a very specific subset of records and archives, but. Yeah, Katrina.
Yeah, I'm happy to ask a question. I know it's getting late for those of us out here. I see, attendance declining a little bit, but I did want to ask a question about how archival description and processing are different if we're foregrounding data reuse possibilities over potentially other collection priorities. And I'm asking partly because Diana, something that stood out to me in your talk was the idea that even though we have, professionally curated museum and museum archive collections, anthropologists still found insufficient context to be able to reuse the data in a meaningful way. And I think struggles around adequately contextualizing data are notoriously plaguing reuse possibilities. So I'm just curious, both you and Christine, this is a theme in your comments too. I'd be interested in your thoughts about, thinking about the fact that it's even hard to contextualize data for the people who created it over time, when they're trying to reuse their own data, which you would think would be an ideal reuse scenario. Even that, it's hard to generate sufficient context for. So I'm just curious about if others here have thoughts about what it means to contextualize archival data for reuse.
Yeah, I think in some cases, working more closely with donors can be really helpful to the processing archivists, such that, they know more about those collections and sometimes ask them to do a little bit more front end work to process collections. I think, unfortunately, what happens most of the time is the limitations of staff and the sort of backlog of archives means that things are being described at a really high and thin level, such that it's very difficult for most collections to be described in any way that's going to really get into the nitty-gritty of the niche topical materials, and then forget it if you're talking about like pretty deep disciplinary jargon or indigenous language material or something like that, right? So I think there's a lot of barriers. But I think some of the work around transcription is helping with some of that, because it allows for that keyword searchability. And then I think certain collections, if they are deemed really high priority, are people will go back and re-describe a collection, or even just take a PDF finding aid and finally get it EAD encoded and get it into the, into a public facing database. So I think some of those things are happening. Selena, did you want to jump in with other thoughts about that, since we talked a little bit about it?
Yeah, no, I can just echo that. In a lot of the interviews, we saw respondents talking about subject terms that they wanted to particularly see. So really getting that deep processing in there. There were some respondents that talked about wanting itemized processing, so item level processing rather than the folder level processing. So at least in the anthropological community, there are a lot of researchers who want that detailed processing happening, and archivists don't really have the resources to do that.
Caitlin, you're nodding.
Yeah, I was gonna say, as like a former practicing archivist before I went back to school again, one thing that we had done at my old job, but was very hard to generalize and do as a wide practice, is try to encourage users to say, like, if you found something you thought was really interesting, if you tell us, we could add it to a finding aid, we can put it into our databases to say, like, oh, when you looked at our collection guide, you didn't see this particular type of data mentioned, and it's the thing that you wanted to use, and then you found it. It could be added if you will tell us about it, essentially. But part of what makes that so hard to practice more widely for a lot of archivists is that user education is often, you know, pretty quickly done, especially in places that are understaffed, which of course they all are. And that a lot of archival users who are not incredibly experienced, frequent users don't necessarily feel comfortable telling an archivist something like that, right? Like going up to the person and saying, like, you missed something in your job, you should fix it. Even though I feel like what we tried to do is make it super clear to our users of, you know, all levels of expertise that, like, actually we want to hear that is helpful for us to know. But it's still something, you know, librarians and archivists will talk about this all the time to say, like, why don't users want to approach us? Why don't they want to tell us things? And some of it is, yeah, just that level of comfortability. So I feel like that is something that some practitioners do work on, trying to get, like, user-generated material that will help us identify underutilized, underdescribed portions of data, but it can be hard to do as well.
Yeah, and I think combining Victoria's points and Hannah's points earlier with that, you know, where in archive space does that information go? Like, where do you put it in your CMS? And so I know, like at the NAA, they've been collecting information please forms since the 1990s. And not all of that has actually been integrated, right? And to your point, Caitlin, as well, I think that's exactly right. I think the most success with getting those forms filled out was when a community of Indigenous users would all come as a group, particularly as part of the Recovering Voices program. And then in a group, and especially with the archivists, really helping that group and talking through the problems of collecting and description, the group would fill out a whole bunch of forms. You know, the person in this photograph is not Tlingit, you know, like, and a lot of stuff like that. But it's hard to do that when they're individuals, and the sort of formality of reading rooms does not feel particularly welcoming to that kind of, yeah, as you were saying, that kind of knowledge being generated.
I put a couple items in the chat as pointers. One is the big user study that we spent several years doing of Don's in the Netherlands, to show how we were able to identify very different kinds of users, and they thought were contributing to or using the archive, and they were using them for very different purposes than were anticipated. But the Baker, Dewar, and Parsons piece is I put in as a flag that communities change over time. So be cautious about going back into that same community. And this is a wonderful one from the Snow and Ice Data Center, where they had 20 years of data on snow and ice to get critical mass to realize how quickly the snow cap was melting. And when that happened, suddenly the archive was overrun by people from all these other disciplines and reporters who knew nothing about snow and ice data. You know, it was designed by and for a very small, very specific community. And they ended up going back and rethinking it, adding new kinds of metadata, new kinds of provenance, saying, how do we reach different kinds of communities? So it's a really well done piece. And I think it's something that should probably be taught across archival education.
Thank you so much for sharing articles with us. Thank you so much.
I'm approaching 12,000 records in my Zotero database. And I'm kind of a walking bibliography.
That's very impressive. That's a very impressive archive. Any other questions from the room or from each other?
I'm curious if anybody in the audience has themselves had a data reuse opportunity, success, difficulty they want to share, either raising their hand or popping it in the chat. And again, to reiterate some of the calls put out at various points in our talk today, if you identify with the sort of cohort of interviewees that are in Katrina's study, broadly as described, please reach out and be a guinea pig. And likewise, if you are working on crowdsourcing or any kind of user-generated content ingest, I'd love to hear from you as well. It was very atmospheric, Diana, though. So sitting in the dark, I don't know.
Glowing face.
And if not, and everybody is feeling, very airy, saturated, and tired, that is fine too. Okay, Katrina, were you going to wrap us up? I've forgotten now.
No, I actually think that our conversation and Christine's last comments were a really excellent sort of bookend on this conversation. So nope, I just put the slide back up in case anybody wants our contact information. And otherwise, we'll hope to see you at future archives conferences with our incoming cohorts of Rad Lab.
Yeah. Oh, and we should also thank Sarah Grun for coordinating this call and this Zoom room for us. And we should have a recording to go up with other ARI recordings. So for folks who missed it or came late, we hope you get to see the rest. And thanks everyone so much for being here.
And thank you, Christine, for your response.
Christine.
Yeah, thank you.
And to our outgoing cohort.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Thanks for the invitation, and delighted to see this work built upon this way.